Now, candidates, the governor, of course, took a no new taxes pledge when he was elected the first time. And he has been roundly criticized over his roughly 7 years here in office that he has, well, let's set the alleged fees and taxes aside, all that. But even if you assume he held his no new taxes pledge, that what happened is the tax burden just got shoved down to the lower levels of government. So that, property taxes, sales taxes, those kinds of things were able to be raised. So it was kind of a fictitious pledge, if you will, in that the tax burden for Minnesotans continue to go up anyway. Then, of course, the argument becomes that this person over here gets hit harder than this person over here because Dakota County is nastier than Lake of the Woods County, or whatever the case may be. Two-part question. You see, I think everybody assumes, well, the governor shouldn't have let that happen. So here's the two-part question. Yes or no? Do you believe it is the state's responsibility to make sure that local governments don't overtax? If you do, how can the state try to manipulate that or regulate it?
This is an interesting question. It goes back to the reason why I originally filed for this office on April 15th. It was my tax protest. I couldn't get to the Tea Party, so I filed. The governor, his history is that in 7 years, he has signed on to 40% increase in spending in the general fund. And we look at Minnesota. I'll try and get to your question before this time is up. If we look at Minnesota and we look at the surrounding states, Wisconsin, Iowa, North and South Dakota, we are the highest in property tax, personal income tax, business tax, workman's comp, and there's another tax escaping me. And we do nothing about it. We have to change that. And I think answering your question,
do you believe the state, do you believe the legislature and the governor should take responsibility for how Dakota County taxes me?
No.
All right, so
that should be left to the local entities.
So in your mind then, if the tax burden gets shoved down, not the governor's fault, not the legislature's fault?
That's a difficult question really to answer, because when we go to property tax, he agreed to 3.5% increase in property taxes with the DFL over 3 years, so that's basically a 12% increase, and I have a problem with that.
Well, we understand that the local units of government are essentially kind of tied in with the state. They're subunits of the state, if you will. But I think some people have, and what I'm getting at is, some people have a philosophical objection to the idea that the state legislature, along with the governor, should be messing around with how cities, counties, townships tax, okay? My question, you said no, you don't believe that ought to be the problem of the legislature and the governor. That's a legitimate position. That's the question I have. And I guess then the next part of it is irrelevant. How should the state manipulate it? Well, in your mind, they shouldn't, right?
Well, I don't have much time, but the state, and it was the last session, not this session, the one before, they approved bonding bills. My local school district has a $15.2 billion budget. They approved that they could write bonds themselves. And my school district has already authorized $11 million in bonding, and they couldn't get a $700,000 referendum passed. And that's thanks to the governor and the legislature.
Over to David, going the other way. David, I want to be clear on this. My question is it St. Paul's responsibility to keep low taxes down, or in any way regulate taxes at the lower levels of government? If so, how would you suggest they do it?
Well, I don't think it is the state government's job to regulate lower units of government. I think that we have a problem. Part of the problem is that we've got too much subsidization of local government by state general fund dollars. If you look at education, for example, Minnesota has the second highest percentage of funding for education coming from the state general fund. There's only one other state in the country that has a higher percentage. Minnesota is about 70%, and the other state is the great education leader of Arkansas. And so my point is that having money come from the state is not a panacea for getting something good to happen. And we have got a lot of things coming from the state general fund that are subsidizing counties and cities and school boards and other local units for things that ought to be locally managed. And when we do this, I think we interrupt a very important relationship, which is the relationship between citizens and the people they elect. And we have to maintain that. We have to do, I think, some thinking about how we want that in the future. And I think we ought to scale that back. So if we say that state government has the power to regulate local taxes, why can't they regulate them up? And they will. We will. In fact, we used to have a statewide property tax. And so I think that if we go down this path and say, well, the legislature should be able to set these tax rates for local governments, well, it may sound good if we're saying we're going to make them go lower, but if you put that principle in place, there's no reason why we can't make them higher. So I would say no.
All right, Bill, what say you? Should the legislature, the governor, be regulating or in any way influencing local tax rates or not?
No, they shouldn't. And the reason being is, I think it's part of our responsibility. You know, the state has to live within its means, and we're not doing that. We're spending way too much money. The government's wasting a lot of money, and under my administration, we're going to go after that waste, and we're going to really attack the budget heavily. But then it's your responsibility as residents of your own communities to get involved, get elected to your city council, get elected to your county commission, get elected to your city council, and bring your conservative values. You know, you can look any place in any city, the waste. You look at the city of Ramsey, they've been on the TV for the last couple weeks about their big city hall complex they've built. They didn't have the money to build it, they went ahead anyhow. In my city alone, we turned down a referendum for a hockey rink 4 times. So what they did, they wanted it, they took and used tax increment financing to build it, which we could have used for other purposes within the city. But we got to get fiscal conservatives on these boards, councils, and commissions to carry the message through and to make cities fiscally responsible.
Leslie, should St. Paul be regulating Dakota County, where I live, or any other county or city on what their tax rates are?
Well, maybe not on the rate, but I like the idea of local control, because then the people can have influence over who they put in office. But you know, everything isn't equal in a city or a county. Somebody has a particular company and they go out of business, then their tax base gets lowered and they're in trouble. So I think we do have to have some kind of way of protecting that, to look after each other, but we don't want to become the state relationship to the cities and the counties as the federal government to us. But I think if we set up a formula of percentages that cities and counties are required to have for the percentage of the population, then we can protect those if they do run into a big problem and they have some major layoffs or a catastrophe.
Okay, if I understand you correctly, you're coming out very much on the opposite side of this issue. You're saying the state ought to try to ensure tax rate structures at the local level so that they can sufficiently run their, or have sufficient funds to run their government. No? Or yes?
Government's job is to protect the fairness to the people in the state, that there be equity, that they follow the state constitution, and the government's job is to make sure that everybody gets a fair shake. If something goes wrong and the people are out of money, or there's a catastrophe, or there's a flood, then how are those people supposed to be left out there on their own? So that's where government comes in to fill that role.
Okay, and I just want to be clear. So you're saying that if St. Paul looks and says, you know, where Thompson lives there, we don't think they're raising sufficient revenue to cope with a really bad storm that does a bunch of damage to county structures, they need to tax more. In your mind, the state should do that?
They can help them out.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Tom, what say you? Do you believe that the state ought to be in the business of in any way regulating tax rates and tax revenues at the local level?
No, I don't, and I respect my colleague immensely, but I couldn't disagree with him more on this issue. The problem I'll tell you what, under our Constitution, the job of government is simply to protect my liberties, my freedoms, that's it. I should be doing the rest. And when it comes to this issue, the problem that I've seen in my short time in St. Paul is we had a system that was designed to work from the individual up. All right, and we have, over the years, continually, in the interest of consolidating our services, we pushed that authority up from the county level to St. Paul, we pushed it from St. Paul to Washington, and look what it's done. We've literally turned upside down the way our founders intended government to work, and I can tell you from first-hand observations that it's really easy for somebody in St. Paul to spend your money. It's a lot more difficult if it's somebody that you're going to the grocery store with, that your kids are in school with, that you're seeing in church and out on the street, out on Main Street in your town, here in Chaska or anywhere else. It's a lot easier for them to be accountable directly to us. That's why you got to push it back down to the local level. You got to make sure that it's accountable at the local level. And no, the answer to your question is no.